Picture this: New York City, the turn of the century. The year is 1893. The air is thick with coal smoke, the smell of horse manure, and the electric hum of a world changing faster than anyone can comprehend. If you stand on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 33rd Street, you are standing at the center of the universe. And towering above you, casting a shadow that seems to swallow the entire city, is a structure that redefined the word luxury, the Waldorf Astoria. But we aren't here to talk about the building. We are here to talk about the man who ran it, the man who breathed life into the stone, George C. Boldt. To call George Boldt a hotel manager is like calling Napoleon a soldier. It misses the point entirely. George Boldt was the king of hosts. He was a titan in a tuxedo. In an era of robber barons, men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, men who built their empires on steel, oil, and blood, Boldt built his empire on something far more fragile: service, perfection, the absolute unyielding demand that for the duration of a dinner or a night's stay, the guest was royalty. Let that sink in. This is the man who popularized the phrase, "The customer is always right," a phrase we take for granted today, muttered by tired retail workers in malls across America. But in 1890, it was revolutionary. It was heresy. It changed the fabric of American commerce. Who was an immigrant, born in Prussia, on the island of Rügen in the Baltic Sea. He came to America with nothing but the dust in his pockets and a work ethic that would eventually kill lesser men. He started in the kitchens. He washed dishes. He peeled potatoes. He saw the machinery of hospitality from the grime up. And by the 1890s, he was arguably the most famous hotelier on the planet. The Waldorf Astoria was his stage. He didn't just manage it. He conducted it like a symphony. He knew the names of the staff. He knew the favorite wines of the European aristocracy. He knew how to soothe the egos of the American nouveau riche. When you walked into the Waldorf, you weren't just renting a room. You were entering George Boldt's world, a world of velvet ropes, literally. He invented the velvet rope to manage the crowds in Peacock Alley, the corridor where the wealthy strutted to be seen. He controlled who got in. He controlled who sat where. He was the gatekeeper of the Gilded Age. But imagine the pressure, the noise, the ceaseless grinding friction of New York City, the steam whistles, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the shouting of newsboys, the relentless demands of the wealthiest, most difficult people on earth. George Boldt lived in the eye of a golden hurricane. He needed an escape. He needed silence. He needed water. And so his eyes turned north, far north, away from the soot of Manhattan, away from the social climbing of the 400, to the borderland between the United States and Canada, the St. Lawrence River, the Thousand Islands. If you have never been to the Thousand Islands, you must understand the geography. It is a place where the earth seems to have shattered. Thousands of years ago, glaciers carved through the granite shield, leaving behind an archipelago of over 1,800 islands scattered across the dark, cold, rushing water of the St. Lawrence. Some islands are large enough for farms. Some are barely large enough for a single pine tree and a seagull. It is a place of violent beauty. In the winter, the river freezes into a sheet of ice 3 feet thick. In the summer, the water is a sapphire blue, crystal clear, cold enough to stop your breath. This was the playground of the Gilded Age elite, but they built cottages. Large wooden structures, certainly, but meant to be rustic, meant to blend in. George Boldt, the man who ran the Waldorf, did not do rustic, and he did not do blending in. He found an island, a specific piece of rock named Hart Island, spelled H-A-R-T, like a stag. It was 5 acres of scrub brush, granite outcroppings, and wind. It was nothing, a speck in the river, a place where a fisherman might stop for lunch, but certainly not a place where one would build a legacy. But Boldt didn't see a rock. He saw a canvas. And more importantly, he saw a Valentine. This is where the story shifts, because Boldt Castle isn't just a story about money. If it were just about money, it would be boring. We have plenty of stories about rich men building big houses to stroke their own egos. No, this was different. This was a love story. George Boldt adored his wife, Louise Carrer Boldt. She was 15 when they met. He was 25. She was the daughter of his employer at the Philadelphia Club. They had married, built a life, and climbed the social ladder together. By all accounts, in a world of arranged marriages and strategic alliances, George and Louise were the real thing. She was his confidant, his partner, the softness to his Prussian hardness. Her birthday was coming up, Valentine's Day, and George decided to give her a present. He bought Hart Island, and then, in a move of a staggering romanticism and logistical insanity, he changed the spelling. He went to the map makers. He went to the county clerks. He changed it from H-A-R-T to H-E-A-R-T, Hart Island. But changing the name wasn't enough. The man who invented the velvet rope wasn't going to settle for a metaphor. He wanted literalism. He hired hundreds of workers. They brought in dynamite. They brought in the steam shovels. And they began to reshape the coastline of the island itself. They blasted the granite. They built massive seawalls. They dredged the river bottom. They physically forced the geography of the island to resemble the shape of a heart. Think about that. In the year 1900, no GPS, no computer-aided design, no helicopters to survey the progress from above, just men, muscle, black powder, and steam. They carved a heart out of solid rock in the middle of a rushing river. And once the stage was set, the real performance began. The construction of the castle. This was not going to be a cottage. This was to be a fortress of the Rhineland, transplanted to upstate New York. A dream of Europe realized in American stone. Boldt hired the architectural firm of G.W. and W.D. Hewitt. He gave them a blank check and a simple instruction: build me a palace for my queen. The scale of the project is difficult to visualize. We are talking about a 6-story masonry structure, 120 rooms, tunnels, a powerhouse, an entry arch, a tower for children to play in. Let's break down the logistics, because this is where the genius of George Boldt shines through. He wasn't just a dreamer, he was an operator. He knew how to move mountains. There are no bridges to Hart Island. There were no bridges then, and there are no bridges now. Every single brick, every bag of cement, every steel beam, every pane of glass, every tapestry, every piece of Italian marble had to be brought in by boat. Barges, scows, steamers. The river was a highway of materials. And remember the winters? The construction season in the Thousand Islands is brutally short. Maybe 6 months if you're lucky. By November, the wind cuts through you like a knife. By January, the river is solid ice. Did they stop? No. They built sleds, massive wooden sleds drawn by teams of horses. They waited for the ice to thicken, for the river to become a frozen plain. And then they slid the granite across the ice. Millions of pounds of a stone hauled over the frozen St. Lawrence by horses breathing steam into the frigid air. Can you hear the sound, the cracking of the ice? The hooves thundering, the sheer danger of it. If a sled broke through, it was gone. The horses were gone. The stone was gone, sunk into the black depths. But Boldt pushed them. He had a deadline. He wanted it finished for Louise. He didn't just build a house, he built a self-contained city. Let's look at the powerhouse. Most mansions of the time had a shed for a generator, maybe a small outbuilding. Not Boldt. He built a medieval fortress, complete with a clock tower and arched a stone bridge, just to house the steam generators. He wanted the utility of the island to be as beautiful as the residents. Inside that powerhouse were massive coal-fired steam engines, capable of generating enough electricity to light a small town. He laid underwater cables. He brought light to the darkness of the river. Then there was the Ulster Tower, the playhouse. This was the first structure to go up. It looks like a defensive tower from a fairy tale, lopsided, whimsical, strange. It was inspired by a tower in Hamburg, Germany. Boldt built it so the family would have a place to stay while the main castle was rising. But this temporary shelter was grander than most permanent homes. It had a bowling alley. It had a stage for theatrical performances. It had a shell room where the ceiling was shaped like the inside of a scallop shell, and then the Leviathan itself, the main castle, rising 6 stories out of the granite. The foundation alone is a marvel of engineering, pinned directly into the bedrock of the island. The exterior was faced with lighter granite, quarried from nearby Oak Island, creating a stark contrast against the dark river water. The roof was tiled in terracotta. The windows were plate glass. Inside, it was designed to be a museum of the world. There was to be a reception room paneled in oak, a ballroom, a library, a billiard room, elevators. Yes, elevators. In a house, on an island, in 1900, the heating system was a marvel of steam pipes and radiators designed to keep the castle warm even in the depths of a New York winter, though they only planned to use it in the summer. Why? Because Boldt demanded perfection. He demanded capacity. He planned a massive stained glass dome for the central hallway. He planned distinct fireplaces for every room, importing mantels from Europe, carved from rare marbles that no longer exist. He commissioned tapestries. He bought art. And the tunnels. We have to talk about the tunnels. Boldt didn't want the sight of deliveries to mar the beauty of the gardens. So he blasted tunnels through the granite underneath the island. Servants could move from the powerhouse to the main castle, from the yacht house to the kitchen, without ever being seen by a guest. It was the Waldorf Astoria philosophy applied to a private home. The service must be invisible. The magic must just happen. By 1903, the structure was dominating the river. It was a beast of stone. The walls were up. The roof was on. The chimneys were smoking. 400 stonemasons, carpenters, and artisans were working on the island simultaneously. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed across the water from dawn until dusk. It was a hive of activity, a symphony of construction. George Boldt would come up from the city on weekends. He would take his steam yacht, the Louise, and patrol the waters around his creation. He would walk the scaffolding. He would touch the stone. He was building a dynasty. He was building a monument that would say to the world, I was here and I loved her. The cost? Irrelevant. Estimates suggest he had poured over $2.5 million into the project by 1904. In today's money, we're talking about $70 or $80 million. And it wasn't finished. It wasn't even close to finished. He was shipping in palm trees. Palm trees. to upstate New York to be placed in the Winter Garden. He was building a yacht house on a nearby island, Wellesley Island, that was so large it could house a fleet of ships. The yacht house alone had quarters for the crews, repair shops, and slips for boats that were 100 feet long. The doors were towering beasts of iron and wood. This was hubris, perhaps. The Greeks would call it hubris. To try to tame the wild St. Lawrence, to try to build a civilized palace on a rock that had known only wind and ice for 10,000 years. But George didn't see it as hubris. He saw it as a gift. Imagine the summer of 1903. The family is there. Louise is there. She is frail. Her health has never been perfect. But she walks the grounds. She sees the Italian gardens taking shape. She sees the Dovecote, a stone tower specifically built to house fancy pigeons. She sees the Peristyle, a massive stone archway that frames the entrance to the harbor, meant for guests to walk under as they disembarked from their steam launches. It is a fantasy world. It is Disney World before Disney was born. But it is real. It is made of granite and oak. George holds her hand. He points to the top of the castle. That is where your room will be, he might have said. The best view on the river. You will be able to see the sun rise over Canada and set over America. Everything was perfect. The money was endless. The vision was clear. The heart was beating. The workers were singing. The steamers were chugging up the river, laden with crates marked fragile and handled with care from Paris, from London, from Rome. Boldt had conquered poverty. He had conquered New York City. He had conquered the hotel industry. And now he was conquering the wilderness. He was the king of hosts. And he was building the ultimate guest room. But there is a rule about fairy tales. There is a rule about castles built for love. The higher the walls, the longer the shadow. And the St. Lawrence River is a place of storms. The water is deep and the water is cold, and it does not care about your money. It does not care about your marble mantles or your velvet ropes. George Boldt had thought of everything. He had planned for the coal, the electricity, the food, the guests, the gardens. He had engineered the very ground he walked on. But there was one thing George Boldt could not engineer, one thing he could not manage, one guest he could not refuse entry to. As the winter of 1903 turned into the fateful year of 1904, the telegrams were not about stone deliveries. They were not about tapestries. The silence of the river was about to be broken, not by the sound of hammers, but by the sound of a heart breaking. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let us freeze time. Let us stand on the dock of Hart Island in late 1903. Look up at the scaffolding, see the hundreds of men swarming over the stone, smell the sawdust and the coal smoke, feel the anticipation. The greatest private home in the history of the region is rising, a testament to the American dream, a testament to a man who has started washing dishes and ended up reshaping the earth. It stands there, proud, defiant, beautiful, a heart made of a stone waiting to be filled with life. Little did they know the silence was coming, and when it came, it would last for 70 years. Picture this. It is the dawn of the 20th century. The year is 1900. The place is the Thousand Islands, that jagged, beautiful scar of geology separating New York from Ontario. And on a heart-shaped island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, the air is no longer filled with the chirping of birds or the gentle lapping of waves. It is filled with the roar of industry. It is filled with the sound of dynamite, the screech of steam whistles, the clang of a steel against a stone. George Boldt isn't just building a summer home. He is declaring war on the concept of impossibility. He is taking a rugged, glaciated rock in the middle of a freezing river, and he is turning it into the Rhineland. To understand the scale of what is happening here, you have to look at the logistics. This isn't building a mansion on Fifth Avenue. You can't just drive a truck up to the site. There are no bridges. Every single nail, every bag of cement, every massive block of granite, every pane of glass has to be floated across the water on barges, in currents that can rip a boat sideways if the captain blinks. 300 men. Let that number settle in your mind. 300 workers, not intermittently every single day. An army of stonemasons, steeplejacks, carpenters, electricians, and plumbers. Boldt didn't just hire local handymen. He imported talent the way he imported caviar for the Waldorf Astoria. He brought in the masters, men with calloused hands and lungs full of granite dust, Italian stone carvers who had to spend their lives restoring cathedrals in Milan, German woodworkers who knew the grain of an oak tree better than they knew the faces of their own children. They descended on Hart Island like a swarm. And the cost? This is where the numbers start to lose their meaning. Boldt planned to spend $2.5 million in 1900. Let's contextualize that. In 1900, the average American worker earned about 22 cents an hour. A carpenter might make $600 a year. A magnificent upper-class home could be built for $5,000. Boldt was spending $2.5 million. In today's economy, with inflation and the sheer scarcity of these materials, we are talking about a project in the hundreds of millions, maybe billions. It wasn't just wealth, it was the GDP of a small nation poured into 5 acres of rock. And what were they building? They were building a fantasy, a romanticized, idealized vision of a German castle filtered through the lens of American industrial might. The style is often called Rhineland romantic, but that feels too tame. This was architectural theater. Boldt wanted the castle to look as if it had been standing there for 500 years. He wanted it to look like knights had defended its ramparts. But inside, he wanted the comforts of the Waldorf. Let's walk the grounds. Because before the main castle even finished rising, the other structures were already defying logic. Look at the Ulster Tower. They called it the Playhouse. But calling the Ulster Tower a playhouse is like calling a Ferrari a go-kart. It was the first major structure completed, the base of operations for the Boldt family while the main castle rose nearby. And it is arguably the strangest, most whimsical building in North America. It was designed to look like a ruined defense tower from the Middle Ages, but not a real ruin, a curated ruin. The masonry is erratic, intentionally so. Boldt told the masons to ignore their levels. He told them to build it slumping. He wanted the stones to jut out at odd angles, to look as if centuries of war and weather had battered them. The result is a lopsided fairy tale structure that looks like it grew out of the earth organically. Inside the Ulster Tower, the eccentricity exploded. There was a shell room designed for dancing with a roof that looked like the inverted hull of a ship. There was a professional-grade bowling alley. There was a kitchen capable of serving a banquet. And the stairs. You have to see the stairs to believe them. They are uneven. No 2 steps are exactly the same height or depth. Why? Because in a real medieval defense tower, the stairs were built unevenly to trip up attackers in sword fights. George Boldt, the hotelier, the perfectionist, made his architects design a tripping hazard into his children's playhouse, just for the sake of historical authenticity. That is the level of obsession we are dealing with. While the family stayed in the Ulster Tower, looking out of the crooked windows at the river, the rest of the island was being reshaped. Look at the yacht house. Across the water, on Wellesley Island, Boldt built a garage for his boats. But again, the word garage is an insult. The Boldt Yacht House is a castle in its own right. It is vast, tall spires, steep roofs, massive iron gates that rise out of the water. Why so big? Because George Boldt owned a fleet. He owned houseboats, he owned speedboats, and he owned the La Duchesse, a houseboat so large it was essentially a floating mansion. The yacht house had to be large enough to swallow 128-foot vessels whole. The masts of the sailing yachts were so tall that the doors of the yacht house had to be towering vertical expanses. It stands there today, massive and imposing, a cathedral to the sport of boating, and then the powerhouse. This is my favorite detail. This is the perfect encapsulation of the Gilded Age. The powerhouse sits on a small rocky outcropping connected to the main island by an arched stone bridge. From the outside, it looks like a fortress, a medieval gatehouse. It has a clock tower that chimes across the water. It has turrets. It has arched windows. But inside, it was a temple to the god of electricity, steam engines, massive coal-fired generators, dynamos humming with dangerous invisible power. Boldt wasn't just building a house, he was building a utility company. At a time when many Americans were still reading by candlelight, Boldt was generating enough DC current to light up a small city. He was electrifying the island. He was running pumps to circulate water. He was powering the refrigeration systems. The exterior said 1500s Germany. The interior said 20th century America. And in the center of it all, rising floor by floor, month by month, was the main castle. 6 stories, 120 rooms. It was constructed of solid granite, not a facade, not a veneer, solid rose-colored granite quarried from nearby Oak Island. The workers cut the stone by hand, wrestling these multi-ton blocks onto skids, hauling them up wooden scaffolding that creaked and groaned under the weight. Imagine the danger. No hard hats, no safety harnesses, just ropes, pulleys, and nerve. Men dangling hundreds of feet in the air, securing the copper roofing, fighting the wind that whips down the St. Lawrence Channel. As the structure closed in, as the roof was sealed, the artisans moved inside, and this is where the luxury becomes suffocating. The ground floor, the grand hall. It wasn't designed as a living room, it was designed as an atrium, a central core that rose up floor after floor, crowned by a stained glass dome 3 stories above. The light would filter down through that glass, amber and red and blue, washing over the marble floor, and oh, the marble. Boldt imported Italian Carrara marble, the white gold of the art world. He used it for statues, he used it for mantles, he used it for the grand staircase that swept upward like a stone waterfall. He installed an elevator, an Otis elevator, in a private home in 1903. This was the height of modernity, a brass-caged, velvet-lined box that would whisk the family from the billiards room in the basement to the solarium on the roof. In the basement, he built a swimming pool, not a hole in the ground, a tiled, heated indoor oasis. Think about the engineering required to have a heated swimming pool in the middle of a river that freezes a solid 4 months of the year. The piping, the boilers, the insulation. It was an act of defiance against the Canadian winter. He planned a ballroom on the top floor, a room with panoramic views of the Thousand Islands, where the orchestra would play and the guests, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the creme de la creme of New York society would dance under the stars. The walls were paneled in oak and walnut. The plasterwork was molded into garlands of fruit and flowers. Every doorknob was heavy brass, cast with the Boldt family crest. And everywhere, literally everywhere, was the symbol, the heart. It was in the ironwork of the gates. It was carved into the granite lintels above the windows. It was woven into the patterns of the parquet floors. Boldt even reshaped the island itself. The shoreline was blasted and filled, manicured and molded until the island was a perfect heart shape. He was writing a love letter in a stone. He was screaming his devotion to Louise across the landscape. By late 1903, the frenzy reached its peak. The structure was 95% complete. The tunnel system underneath the island was finished, a labyrinth of underground passageways so the servants could move invisible, carrying coal and ice and food, popping up in the main house like magic. The roof was on. The windows were glazed. The cold wind of the river could no longer get inside. It is January 1904. Winter has gripped the river. The St. Lawrence is a sheet of white ice, feet thick. The wind howls around the stone towers, whistling through the copper eaves. But inside the castle, there's warmth. Heaters are being tested. The smell of sawdust is fading, replaced by the smell of beeswax and polish. Crates are piling up on the docks and in the lower storage rooms. Hundreds of crates. Inside them, treasures, tapestries from France dating back to the 1700s, rugs from Persia, thick and crimson, furniture commissioned specifically for these rooms, statues, paintings, porcelain services for 100 guests. It is all there, waiting. The workers are exhausted but proud. They can see the finish line. They know they have built the greatest home in the region, perhaps the greatest home in the estate. They talk about the party that will happen when Mr. Boldt arrives. They say he plans to give it to her on Valentine's Day, February 14th. A birthday present, a Valentine, the ultimate romantic gesture. Imagine the anticipation, the foreman checking his watch, the stonemasons packing up their chisels for the last time, the painters putting the final gold leaf on the ceiling of the ballroom. Everything is perfect. Everything is ready. The dream is solid. You can touch it. You can walk through it. George Boldt is in New York City, preparing to travel north. Louise is with him. The castle stands silent in the snow, a sleeping giant waiting for its masters. The Ulster Tower is dark. The powerhouse is humming quietly, keeping the lights on for an arrival that feels inevitable. There's a sense of destiny here, a feeling that this family, this man who came from nothing, has finally conquered the world. He has tamed the river. He has built his kingdom. But destiny is a cruel architect. It builds you up, stone by stone, just to watch the structure fall. The telegraph lines are buzzing between New York City and the Thousand Islands. A message is coming. It is a message that will travel through the copper wires, under the snow, across the frozen miles. A message that carries no weight physically, just a series of clicks, a series of dots and dashes. But when it arrives, it will hit Heart Island harder than the dynamite ever did. The silence is coming. The workers are scraping the last of the mortar. They are laughing. They are thinking about their paychecks. They are thinking about the spring thaw. They don't know that the dream is already dead. They don't know that the lady of the house, the muse, the heart of the island, is gone. And the tragedy isn't just that she died. People die every day. The tragedy is what happened next. Because when you build a monument to love and the love leaves, what do you do with the monument? Do you live in it? Do you sell it? Or do you turn your back on it and walk away, leaving the doors unlocked and the windows open to the wind? Up next, the telegram, the exodus, and the 70-year sleep of the castle on the river. Voice over. January 1904. The river is frozen, a sheet of iron-gray ice stretching from shore to shore. The wind howls down from Canada, the kind of wind that cuts through wool and bites into the bone. It screams through the scaffolding. It rattles the crates of Italian marble waiting on the dock. On Hard Island, the air is usually filled with the symphony of construction, the clinking of chisels, the shouting of foremen, the rumble of steam engines. For 4 years, this island has been the loudest place in the Thousand Islands. A hive, a machine, a relentless engine of creation driven by one man's will. But then, silence. It starts with a boat, a small vessel crunching through the thinner ice near the mainland, fighting the current to reach the island. It carries a messenger, and the messenger carries a piece of yellow paper, a telegram. Picture the scene. A foreman, perhaps standing near the powerhouse, his breath pluming in the frigid air, wiping the stone dust from his hands to take the envelope. He opens it. He reads the words. There are not many words. Telegrams were charged by the word, but even if they had been free, there was nothing else to say. The message was from George Boldt, and it did not contain instructions for the next shipment of tapestries. It did not contain a modification to the grand staircase. It contained a command that would shatter the future of the island forever. Stop all work. 3 words. Stop all work. And then the reason. The sledgehammer blow that followed the command. Louise has died. Let that sink in. Louise, the reason for the stone, the reason for the 120 rooms, the reason for the tunneling and the blasting and the carving, the muse, the heart. She was gone, dead at the age of 41. Heart failure, sudden, irreversible. She was the light of George Boldt's life, and in an instant the light was extinguished. The foreman must have stared at that paper for a long time, the snow falling around him, the castle looming above, a half-finished giant. What happens next is the stuff of legend. It is the moment that transforms Boldt Castle from a construction site into a ghost story. The order is given, the whistles blow, not the lunch whistle, not the end-of-day whistle, the final whistle. 300 workers, stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from New York, laborers who had spent years of their lives on this rock. They put down their tools. They didn't pack them away. They put them down. Hammers were left on workbenches. Trowels were left sitting in buckets of half-mixed mortar. Crates of imported furniture, just arrived from Europe, sat unopened on the dock. A half-eaten lunch, a sandwich wrapped in newspaper, was left on a sawhorse. They walked to the boats, they left the island, and they never came back. George Boldt, the man who commanded armies of servants at the Waldorf Astoria, the man who changed the skyline of New York City, was broken. He was a titan of industry, a man who believed that with enough money and enough will, he could bend reality to his desires, but he could not buy life. He could not negotiate with death. He sent a second telegram to the island's caretaker. The instructions were even simpler than the first. Whatever is done, stop. Do not drive another nail. Do not lay another stone. And then, the kicker, the decision that defines the tragedy. George Boldt never set foot on Hart Island again. He never returned to see the towers he had raised. He never walked the halls he had designed for her. He turned his back on the millions of dollars, the years of effort, the dream. He walked away. He left it all. The castle, the powerhouse, the arch, the stone gazebo. He left it to the wind. He left it to the river. And so began the Great Decay. 73 years. Think about that span of time. 73 years from 1904 to 1977. Empires rose and fell in that time. World War I shattered Europe. The Roaring Twenties danced and died. The Great Depression brought America to its knees. World War II burned the globe. The atomic bomb, the moon landing, Vietnam, disco. And through it all, Boldt Castle stood in the darkness, silent, waiting, rotting. It was a slow death. At first, it was just the dust, settling on the marble floors, coating the uninstalled fireplaces. Then the animals moved in, birds nesting in the rafters of the ballroom, swallows darting through the empty window frames, raccoons making homes in the servants' quarters. Then the weather, the brutal, unrelenting winters of the St. Lawrence River. You have to understand the violence of a Thousand Islands winter. The temperature drops to 20, 30, below zero. Moisture gets into the stone. It freezes, it expands, it cracks the granite, it pushes the mortar out. Roof tiles began to slip. Water, the great enemy of all architecture, found its way in. It trickled down the grand staircase. It pooled in the basement. It rotted the subfloors. The oak paneling, imported at such great cost, began to warp and peel like dead skin. The plaster swelled and crumbled, falling in chunks to the floor, creating a carpet of debris that grew thicker with every passing decade. But nature was not the only enemy. Man was worse. For decades, the island was unsecured. It became a destination for the curious, the bored, and the malicious. Fishermen would stop on the island to cook a shore lunch. They would tear up the priceless mahogany flooring to build their campfires. Let that horrific image settle in your mind. Wood that had been shipped across the Atlantic, wood meant for the feet of a Gilded Age princess, ripped up and burned to fry perch. Vandals came. They brought a spray paint. They brought sledgehammers. They smashed the terracotta roof tiles just to hear the sound of them breaking. They threw rocks through the stained glass dome. They carved their initials into the limestone arches. J.D. was here, 1954, class of 67. The castle became a canvas for graffiti, a playground for destruction. Everything of value that could be carried was stolen. The copper flashing was stripped from the roof. The lead piping was ripped from the walls. Statues were toppled and beheaded. It was a corpse being picked clean by vultures. By the 1960s, Boldt Castle was a skeleton, a terrifying, looming ruin. Locals called it the Castle of the Damned. It was dangerous. Floors were missing. Staircases ended in mid-air. If you walked into the basement, you were walking into a pitch-black labyrinth of water and rot. And yet it stood. The shell remained. The silhouette against the sunset was still there. The Rhineland towers still pierced the sky. The heart was broken, but the body refused to die. It was too big, too strong, too stubborn to fall completely. It was a testament to the quality of the construction George Boldt had demanded. Even after 7 decades of absolute neglect, the walls held. But by 1977, the end was near. The roof was failing catastrophically. The upper floors were on the verge of collapse. The structure was being consumed by the forest. Trees were growing inside the rooms. Roots were prying apart the foundation. The Boldt family still owned it, but they could do nothing with it. It was a white elephant, a liability, a tax burden, and then the miracle, the Thousand Islands Bridge Authority. They looked at this rotting hulk and they didn't see a ruin. They saw a jewel. They saw history. They saw the soul of the region. In 1977, the Boldt family sold the island to the Bridge Authority for $1, one single dollar. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. The deal was that all revenues from the castle's operation as a tourist attraction had to be poured back into its restoration, every penny. And so the resurrection began. But this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. This was not a completion. The authority made a crucial philosophical decision. They would not finish the castle. They would not try to guess what George Boldt would have done. They would not fill it with modern furniture and pretend the tragedy never happened. No, their mission was preservation, not completion. They stabilized the roof. They stopped the water. They cleared the tons of debris. They scrubbed the graffiti from the stones. They installed windows, thousands of them, to seal the building envelope. But they left the story visible. If you go there today, you can see it. You can walk through the first floor, and it is glorious. The grand staircase has been restored to a brilliance it never even knew in 1904. The marble gleams. The chandeliers sparkle. It looks like a palace. But then, go upstairs. Go to the upper floors. Here, the walls are still bare studs. The electrical wires are still exposed. The old knob and tube wiring that was cutting edge in 1900. You can see the pencil marks on the beams where the carpenters of 1904 wrote their measurements. You can see the stopwork sensation frozen in amber. It is a haunting juxtaposition. The bottom is life. The top is death. The bottom is what could have been. The top is what is. They didn't try to hide the scars. They framed them. And in doing so, they saved the emotion of the place. If they had finished it completely, if they had made it into just another shiny mansion, it would have lost its power. It would have been just a house. A big house, sure. A fancy house, but just a house. By leaving it unfinished, it remains a monument. It is a monument to a broken heart. Walking through those halls today, you don't feel the presence of a family that lived there. You feel the presence of a family that didn't. You feel the absence. You stand in the ballroom and you realize no dance was ever held there. No music ever played. No champagne corks ever popped. The only sound for 70 years was the wind whistling through the empty window frames, singing a mournful song for Louise. It's a strange kind of tragedy. Usually, ruins are sad because they represent a fall from grace, a castle that was once full of life, now empty. But Boldt Castle, it never had the life to begin with. It is a memory of a future that never happened. And that is why it captivates us. That is why millions of people take the boat ride across the river. We don't go just to see the architecture. We have plenty of architecture. We don't go just to see the wealth. We have plenty of wealth. We go to touch the tragedy. We go to stand in the shadow of a love so big it tried to move mountains, and a loss so deep it stopped time itself. George Boldt died in 1916. He died in his room at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. He was surrounded by his family. He was a success in every sense of the word. He died a wealthy man, a respected man. But a part of him had died 12 years earlier on a cold January day when he held a telegram in his hand. He is buried in the Bronx in Woodlawn Cemetery. He lies next to Louise And 500 miles away, on a heart-shaped island in the middle of a frozen river, his castle stands guard. The windows are glassed in now, the roof is sound, the gardens are in bloom, thousands of flowers planted every spring, just as he would have wanted. But at night, when the tourists leave and the last boat pulls away from the dock and the sun dips below the Canadian horizon, the silence returns. The same silence that fell in 1904, the silence of a hammer put down, the silence of a door closing, the silence of a love story with no ending. It stands there, a stone sentinel, a palace of potential, Boldt Castle, the house that love built and the house that grief abandoned.